Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Patryk Witkowski and I am joined today by Olaf Stando, ex-SNP Digital Media Officer and currently the Campaigns and Engagement Manager for the Scotland National Union of Students. Starting off with the Ukraine update, day 700, at least 18 people were killed and more than 130 wounded in a massive Russian airstrike in Ukraine on Tuesday. Volodymyr Zelensky said, the air raids mostly targeted the two largest cities, the capital, Kiev, and Kharkiv in the east. Ukraine's president said more than 200 sites were struck, including 139 dwellings. Celeste Wallander, Pentagon Assistant Secretary of Defense, has said Russia's military is carrying out probing attacks with barrages of missiles and drones in an attempt to find weaknesses in the Ukraine's defense, as U.S. funding for security assistance is tied up in Congress. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban said he had invited Sweden's Prime Minister to visit and negotiate his country joining the NATO military alliance, a process that Hungary and Turkey have delayed. Turkey's parliament voted on Tuesday to accept Sweden as a NATO member. Lloyd Austin, the U.S. Defense Secretary, has made his first appearance since being hospitalized for cancer treatment. Austin spoke via video link at the opening of a meeting on military aid for Ukraine. The security of the entire international community is on the line in Ukraine's fight. I am more determined than ever to work with our allies and partners to support Ukraine and to get the job done, Austin said. In an interview with German media, Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba has said the Western allies aren't supplying Ukraine with enough ammunition and air defense missiles. Russian attacks on Kiev and Kharkiv on Tuesday clearly show the need to provide more anti-air defense systems, as well as more surface-to-air missiles. Kuleba said he was still in talks with the German government about receiving Taurus cruise missiles, even after the lower house of the German parliament voted a week ago against delivering them. We'll never give up, Kuleba said. Germany's finance minister has said it can't keep up Ukraine's defense capabilities on its own in the long term, and others will need to increase bilateral contributions. 20 days in Mariupol, Mistila Chernov's chronicle of a besieged Ukrainian city and the international journalists who remained there after Russia invaded have been nominated for Best Documentary at the Oscars. A Polish official has said Poland and the Baltic states are calling for import bans on the Russian aluminium and liquefied natural gas, LNG, for the European Union's 13th package of sanctions against Moscow over its Ukraine invasion. Slovakia's Prime Minister, Robert Fico, insisted life in the Ukrainian capital was absolutely normal, just hours after Russian missiles fell on Kiev and a day before his first meeting with the Ukrainian Prime Minister. Olaf, I was just wondering if you could comment on how you feel hearing about like the bombing of capital cities and residential areas where people might just trying to live their normal lives.
Well, it's a surreal situation, isn't it, with Slovakia Prime Minister Robert Fico saying that there is no war and that there is no bombing in Kiev. We're truly in the post-truth era. And of course, speaking of that post-truth era, Trump has just won New Hampshire, and it looks increasingly likely that Trump might be, president of the US in 10 months' time. So I think at this crucial time, so obviously day 700 of the Ukraine war, this escalation of the Ukraine war, I mean, obviously the war's been going on for 10 years. We're going to have the 10th anniversary of the occupation of Crimea in February. But, at this time, it's really important to firstly keep focus on Ukraine. And I think it's credit to Broadcasting Scotland that you have that daily Ukraine update and it's top of the agenda because that's slipping down a lot of people's thoughts at the moment. And, it is a difficult situation. It's very clear that Putin is very emboldened. A lot of the West's focus on Ukraine is slipping. There's an increasing amount of frustration at the stalemate on the battlefield. So, it's not an easy situation. Russia has been making some territorial gains, and I think without the urgent military aid that Ukraine needs, we're going to have a more difficult situation as we go deeper into the winter. So, look, it's really important that Hungary stops blocking the EU funding package. Obviously, there's $50 billion frozen in the Congress as well in the US. That's important to unblock before Trump takes reins. And it's not looking very pretty right now.
Thank you for that. Moving on to the Israel and Gaza update. 210 Palestinians were killed in Israeli strikes and nearly 400 were injured in the previous 24 hours, according to the latest figures from the Gaza Health Ministry. The International Court of Justice in The Hague has said it will deliver its verdict this week on the request for provisional measures submitted by South Africa in the case against Israel. In a statement, the court said the 17-judge panel will hand down its ruling on Friday at 1200 hours GMT. South America is asking for the UN court to act urgently to protect against further severe and irreparable harm to the rights of the Palestinian people under the Genocide Convention, which continues to be violated with impunity. The director of the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA, in Gaza has cited reports saying that the 9 Palestinians have been killed and 75 injured after what he described as an attack on a UN training center designed as shelter in Khan Yunis. In an update, White said two tank rounds hit the building and that was sheltering about 800 displaced people in the southern Gaza Strip. Witnesses reported fierce gun battles in the west of Khan Yunis, where the Israeli military said it had killed numerous squads of gunmen with a sniper, tank, and aerial fire. The Palestinian Red Cross Society, which runs Al-Amal Hospital, said troops had blockaded its staff inside and imposed a curfew in the area, including its local headquarters, where 3 displaced individuals have been killed. Aid group Doctors Without Borders said its staff were trapped inside Nasser Hospital with about 850 patients and thousands of displaced people because the surrounding roads were inaccessible or too dangerous. People fleeing the vicinity of Nasser Hospital have been shot at by Israeli tanks as well as attack drones, said the Al Jazeera journalist Hani Mahmoud, reporting from Rafah outside Gaza, in southern Gaza. Abir Etefa, the World Food Programme's senior Middle East spokesperson, has warned of a catastrophic food insecurity in Gaza. Israel continues to target health institutions in Gaza, with Ahmed al-Mandari, the World Health Organization's regional director for the Eastern Mediterranean. Mandari said the situation in the Gaza Strip was catastrophic and that the number of workers in medical institutions had decreased to just 5%. The Israeli government spokesperson, Lana Steen, ruled out a Gaza ceasefire on Wednesday, despite reports that negotiations on hostage releases were progressing and repeated international calls for Israel to cease its month-long bombardment of the Gaza Strip. Israel forces arrested 35 Palestinians, including a woman and former prisoners, in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem, reported Al Jazeera, citing data released by the Palestinian Prisoners Affairs Authority. Israeli troops demolished the home of a Palestinian accused of assisting in the killing of 4 Israelis near a settlement in the occupied West Bank in June. Yemeni Houthi authorities have ordered U.S. and British staff of a UN and Sana'a-based humanitarian organization to leave the country within a month. Pope Francis issued a new plea against all wars as he evoked the horror of the mass killing of Jews and other victims of Nazis in advance of Saturday's Holocaust Memorial. I was wondering, regarding the International Court of Justice, how impactful do you think this Friday ruling could be?
I think the South African case is looking pretty strong, and of course, I'm not an expert on genocide, on international law, so I reserve that judgment to the ICJ judges. But I think this is quite an important and landmark case. We know that ICJ rulings have made history and have turned the tides of history in the past. Of course, this is just a preliminary judgment, so this is basically just a judgment to ensure whether the case can be heard, and then we're going to have several years to actually determine the evidence in front of us. But I think, look, it is quite clear that a lot of the Israeli politicians at the most senior levels of government, whether it's the Israeli cabinet or whether it's Israeli journalists, are using genocidal language with genocidal intent and are committing war crimes on almost a daily basis. Look, I mean, just today at PMQs, we've had the case of, the man, Ramzi Abu Salul, who was obviously killed with impunity while waving a white flag. We had that shocking footage from the ITV. That is clearly a war crime under international conventions. The Human Rights Watch has condemned that today, but also it's not new. It has happened before in December. Remember that footage of refugee camps being bombed. Again, people were waving white flags and people were being killed. And this had happened before this escalation as well. I mean, the Human Rights Watch has published a report in 2009, I think, showing how people in Gaza were bombed despite having white flags clearly in shot. So I think the wider picture of the conflict looks bleak. I mean, Israel told people to evacuate to the only safe zone in Gaza, the Al-Mawasi zone, of course, the zone that has no sanitation, a zone that is the size of a couple of football pitches. And even the Al-Mawasi area is being bombed. Han Yunis, where people were told to evacuate in December from the north to the south, is now the biggest flashpoint in the fighting. It is extremely worrying to see hospitals and schools and UN facilities being targeted so indiscriminately. So I think the ICJ judgment will take a while, but the political momentum is definitely behind the South African and Irish case. And I think South Africa and Ireland have been leading the way. I mean, look, a lot of the European countries have been moving more towards calling for a ceasefire. We've had many governments, like the Spanish government, the Scottish government, of course, advocating for it months ago already. But I think as it becomes clearer that the Israeli government is, killing people with impunity, we've had more than 25,000 dead in Gaza. I think that momentum is going to keep shifting towards the Palestinian side. Well, not just the Palestinian side, the side of human rights and the side of justice, let's just say, because it's not about human rights, it's not about Palestinians or Israelis. It's about whether Israel is meeting its international obligations or it isn't. And at the moment, it's looking like it isn't.
Thank you again. Shifting over to the UK, in a dramatic intervention on last night, the Tory MP Simon Clarke, who was a cabinet minister in Liz Truss's short-lived government, urged Sunak to quit and make way for a new Tory leader. Mr. Clarke said Rishi Sunak should resign before he leads the Conservatives to, quote, extinction. A Tory MP has said in an excoriating attack on the Prime Minister. In an op-ed for The Telegraph, Clarke said Sunak's uninspiring leadership is the main obstacle to our recovery, and that he has sadly gone from asset to anchor. He argued that Sunak is leading the Conservatives into an election where we will be massacred, end quote, because he does not get what Britain needs, and he is not listening to what the British people want, end quote. UK Government Postal Affairs Minister Kevin Hollinrake said Clarke's intervention was a sign of a panic that is brewing in some factions, but said it was not a view held by the wider parliamentary party. Hollinrake said it would be good advice for Simon Clarke to head to a dark room, lie down, and sort himself out. A number of senior Conservative MPs swiftly criticized Clarke's comments, including the former Home Secretary Priti Patel, who said engaging in facile and divisive self-indulgence only serves our opponents. A confidence vote on the Prime Minister will be triggered if 53 Tory MPs submit letters to the 1922 committee. So far, Clarke and former Minister Dame Andrea Jenkins are the only Conservative MPs to have publicly called for Sunak to go. I was wondering, Olaf, with only two public calls for Prime Minister Sunak's resignation, how widespread is discontent within the party, and is anybody posturing themselves for future leadership?
Well, I think firstly it's important to note that Simon Clarke, of course, owes his career, his very brief job experience career in cabinet, thanks to Liz Truss, who herself was outlived by letters. So I'm not sure if, getting advice from someone who has backed someone who was outlived by letters is necessarily the smartest political acumen. But look, Simon Clarke is panicking, as is most of the Tory party. We have Labour leading by 25 to 30 points in the polls. The Tories are about 20 to 22%. But you clearly have this panic setting, not just among Tories, but among Tory press. I mean, all of this is based on that YouGov poll that came out last week, which showed that hypothetical Tory Prime Minister, which sticks to Conservative values and cuts taxes, would beat Keir Starmer. Firstly, that is a complete fallacy of a polling question, because that person doesn't exist. The Tories have had 3 prime ministers in the past year and a half. The Tories have been in government for 14 years in the UK, and it's quite clear that the Tories are completely done. And I think that level of desperation shows, firstly, the self-indulgence on the Tory benches. They care more about saving their own careers and saving their own seats rather than tackling the deep-rooted problems that the country is facing. But it just shows that the time is up. And actually, the longer Rishi Sunak is waiting to call the election, the longer he's just delaying the pain that all the MPs are going to face. I think every single Tory MP and their dog knows that this government is toast. They know that they're going to lose decisively. Now, I'm not saying that the Labour Party offers a much better alternative. I think the Labour Party, of course, is a better choice than the Tories. But looking at Keir Starmer's many U-turns and his entire warehouse of flip-flops, I don't put a huge trust in Labour to transform the economy, which is what we need. But just going back to Simon Clarke, look, this is a desperate man in a desperate party. And I think the fact that the 2 Tory MPs have publicly put letters in against Rishi Sunak shows that this is not going to happen. Nothing's going to change. The inevitable defeat.
Thank you. An SNP MP leads debate on the dangerous nuclear weapons infrastructure. In Westminster now, the SNP's defence spokesperson, Martin Doherty Hughes MP, is leading an adjournment debate called for greater scrutiny over the UK government's handling of a nuclear weapons infrastructure in Scotland. In December 2023, Dominic Cummings, who we see speaking now on the right.
Gentleman is popular, and it's very good that there are so many people here to listen to him. We'll tell him later why. Martin Doherty Hughes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very grateful for the opportunity that Mr Speaker has given to raise an issue that I think we can all agree deserves wider attention and scrutiny. And I don't think I've ever done an adjournment debate on a Wednesday, or one so well attended, I have to say. And I don't think I've ever done an adjournment. I'm so glad I have to be would be actually done relatively a decent hour, because I do know there's something happening after this adjournment debate within this very chamber. Now, I want to start with the debate with an appeal to the front bench of the government, and also to anyone else who might be thinking of intervening. Now, it is clear I'm a member of the Scottish National Party, and this is a debate that does concern the UK's nuclear enterprise. On this level, I think it might be fairly predictable. But I hope in preparing for this debate that the Minister, I hope, has left all the kind of customary, usual stuff reserved for SNP MPs discussing the nuclear weapons in this place. I do hope he's left them at home or in the MOD, because it may be tempting to play to our bases in terms of this debate and to paint this as yet another, forgive me for saying it, Madam Deputy Speaker, and close to Burns night, haggis-munching, bus bagpipe whinging again. But I hope we can all agree the trigger for this debate was some very serious allegations from a senior official. And I think people across these islands who live beside or in the vicinity of nuclear-regulated sites deserve to hear a response to these allegations. And also glad to see the Shadow Secretary of State is in his position as well. Not right now, but if you just allow me for a moment. Now, I have to say, I'm going to set aside my own and my party's well-known and understood standpoint on the morality and utility of the nuclear enterprise to focus on the specifics of the allegations made in the blog of the 30th December by a well-known former adviser, Dominic Cummings. And I hope that the Minister will reciprocate and show the House the respect it deserves. And as another small caveat, let me make it clear from the outset that I understand, Madam Deputy Speaker, 3 things about Dominic Cummings. That he certainly has his own well-published agenda when it comes to issues around the civil service, especially around civil service reform. That he is demonstrably not as clever as he actually thinks. And finally, that he has also been known to present dead cat arguments as a distraction from his own shortcomings. in this instance that the Prime Minister chose not to rehire him as an advisor. I'll give way to my right honourable.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. The honourable gentleman and I will have different opinions about nuclear ability, and I believe we should have it. The honourable gentleman says no, but on this issue I think we agree in relation to safety. Does the honourable member not recognise that our need for nuclear defence is imperative to the security of this nation to fulfil international obligations, and yet this cannot be achieved without substantial investment? However, this is not optional. The money must be found, and found now, to ensure nuclear safety, but equally important, nuclear ability.
My answer to the honourable gentleman is he might as well stay for the rest of the adjournment debate to find out my point on that. I have to say about Mr Cummings' former role and the nature of the allegations, Madam Deputy Speaker, he made such that it is frankly bizarre, at least from my perspective, that the only attempt to scrutinise them is not in front of a parliamentary committee, but in what, frankly, is usually the graveyard spot of parliamentary business. Parliament, I would say, Madam Deputy Speaker, I guess, is sovereign in everything apart from the nuclear enterprise. Now, I am afraid going to quote Mr Cummings' blog quite extensively here today, and I would hope that the Minister would have already read it, but it is important to have it read into the record of the House. There are two principal aspects I would like the Government to respond to. Firstly, the state of the defence nuclear infrastructure across these islands, and then a decision-making process in the civil service and how this relates to democratic oversight. Now, I should also say, before the Minister uses up time from his response, to say
the comments being mentioned were comments made in December 2023 by Dominic Cummings, the former chief advisor of the Prime Minister, who released a statement in which he referenced the fundamentally critical issue of the scandal of nuclear weapons infrastructure, which is a dangerous disaster and a budget nightmare of hard-to-believe and highly classified proportions. The MP for West Dumbartonshire has demanded that the Ministry of Defence investigate these comments as a matter of urgency, saying that while nuclear weapons remain on Scottish soil, the Whitehall Department must take the necessary steps to ensure any structural and mechanical issues of Faslane or Coalport bases are addressed to protect the workers and surrounding communities. The warning of the former chief advisor caused particular concern, given that there have been numerous reports of Royal Navy nuclear submarine emergencies in recent months, including in November 2023, when a mechanical fault above a Vanguard submarine caused an unplanned deep dive by the vessel, endangering the lives of 140 crew on board. The SNP have repeatedly called for Trident, the UK nuclear weapons programme based in Scotland, to be scrapped for good. Commenting, SNP MP Martin Doherty-Hughes says, "The UK government must investigate and come clean over whether there is any truth to the comments made by the former Prime Minister's chief advisor. The SNP are clear that the nuclear weapons programme should be scrapped. However, whilst the UK government continues to impose the billion-pound Trident programme upon Scotland, and while it remains on Scottish soil, the Ministry of Defence has a responsibility to ensure any structural or mechanical issues within either Faslane or Coalport bases are addressed as a matter of urgency. By failing to take the necessary steps, they are placing the lives of the workers who in the surrounding communities in danger, and making clear their blatant disregard for Scotland." Olaf, passing over to you. Submarines, the nuclear submarines are a major part of the Trident program, and as many are approaching their expiration date in the next couple of years, do you think there's considerable argument to renew the Trident program and these submarines?
No, of course not. Look, Trident is financially unjustifiable, right? The Commons Foreign Affairs Committee a couple of years ago has calculated that the total cost of the next generation of Trident is around 180 billion over its lifetime. And the C&D has said about 205 billion. Whichever way you look at it, right? Trident nuclear weapons are a system designed for the Cold War, and the case for Trident is extremely hard to justify, though it's wrong, not just morally, and I think it's right that the SNP talk about the moral case against nuclear weapons, but it's also wrong financially and strategically as well. For all the shortcomings of Trident, you have to recognize that the maintenance of the deterrent is extremely expensive, All of that is money that could be spent on conventional forces instead. That would be a lot cheaper. You could spend a lot more money, for example, on cybersecurity or on drones, on the Navy. You also have a situation where the vast majority of Scottish MPs have consistently opposed Trident renewal. I mean, in 2016, I think 58 out of 59 Scotland's MPs voted against it. You have Scotland's biggest city, about 25 miles, next to Trident, Glasgow. And of course, these safety issues are really, really exacerbating fears of something a lot more serious than what's been going on. There is no justification. And I think what is particularly interesting is that, not least, the UK government obviously signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They trampled all over it because they've increased the amount of nukes even more, that they have increased the number of nukes that the government can stockpile by, I think, 40%. Amid all this, the Labour Party, which historically has been the party of reason and, dare I say, of pacifism, is actually giving a complete blank check to this and supporting it every single step of the way, with blatant disregard for the people living in Glasgow and the west of Scotland, with blatant disregard for the huge amount of money that this is costing, which could be spent instead on conventional military or indeed on public services, education, and tackling the scourge of poverty in Scotland. So, yeah, I mean, Trident is something that makes my blood boil, frankly, because it is this broken consensus that somehow we need to keep the nuclear deterrent just to kind of keep up the pretense of Britain's greatness, or whatever. It's just not working, and there really has to be a serious conversation about the future of Trident itself.
Thank you. The cost of Hinkley Point C nuclear plant spirals to £46 billion. The owner of Hinkley Point C has blamed inflation, COVID, and Brexit as it announced the nuclear power plant project could be delayed by a further 4 years and cost £2.3 billion more. The plant in Somerset, which has been under construction since 2016, is now expected to be finished by 2031, the cost up to £35 billion. France's EDF said, however, the cost will be far higher once inflation is taken into account, because EDF is using 2015 prices, adjusting for today's prices. The cost of Hinkley Point C nuclear power plant spirals to £46 billion. As well as the cost of the taxpayer rising, the project will now be delayed until 2029 at the earliest. The initial budget was £18 billion with a scheduled completion date of 2025. Dave Dugan MP, the SNP's net zero and energy spokesperson, has warned that only clean, renewable energy will tackle the climate emergency, bring soaring energy bills down, and all for a fraction of a price. Commenting, Dave Dugan MP said, "This latest delay demonstrates that Westminster's nuclear obsession will do nothing to help people battling the Westminster-made cost of living crisis. For months, we've heard endless lectures from the Tories on why nuclear is the way forward, yet time and time again we learn of how difficult this latest project is and how much it's costing the taxpayer. It's abundantly clear that nuclear will cost more, is costing more, and will send bills soaring even further, all while households in Scotland can see clean, renewable energy being produced in their own backyards." Olaf, the Conservative government has repetitively failed at these long-term infrastructure plans, HS2 and the countless nuclear energy plants being a good example. What do you see as the root cause of these spiraling costs and these unfinished plans?
Well, I think it's firstly incompetence in delivery. We see that across HS2, we see that across Hinkley Point. Basically, every single major infrastructure project that the UK government sought to build has spiraled out of control, with budgets doubling, as in this case, with this revelation today. And I think going back to this point about Trident, actually, it's connected to this illusion of grandeur, right? You have to do things on a massive scale because we are Great Britain and we have this kind of complex of doing everything huge and impressive. Look, one nuclear power plant, I think, takes about 14 to 15 years from planning to completion on average, right? Massive nuclear projects like Hinkley will take a lot longer than that. Around 7 million people each year die from air pollution, right? With about 90% of that, so about over 6 million people every single year dying from energy-related combustion pollution, right? So following on from that, the faster we switch our energy system from fossil fuels to renewable, the better, right? Now, of course, we need to explore all the different possibilities for switching towards a fossil-free future. But the fact is, wind farms, solar farms, hydro projects take about 2 to 4 years from planning to completion, right? Big nuclear projects take about 14, 15, 20 years, right? Rooftop solar projects on a small scale, so whether that's on a house or on a community building, take about 6 months to a year. So transitioning to 100% renewable energy is just a lot quicker and a lot more efficient and a lot cheaper as well, because we see the huge costs that have spiraled in this Hinkley project. So nuclear is not the answer. I think for countries that already have a lot of nuclear energy, like France, it doesn't make sense to shut the nuclear down because it's still a greener and more efficient way of producing energy. But I think new nuclear projects are just not the answer. The cost of energy for a new nuclear plant is huge in comparison to solar and wind. You also have, the meltdown risk, which of course has been reducing, but it's still a real threat that doesn't exist with renewables. And fundamentally, what we need in Scotland, which has this abundance of renewable energy, is we need to decentralize the way that the energy is generated. If we look at Scandinavia, for example, if we look at even Germany, a lot of countries have models where communes and communities own their energy generation, where a council, and by the way, we have to decentralize councils as well for that, but where a council could set up a decentralized energy company where the profits don't go to corporate shareholders like EDF, for example, in this case, but go directly to the community and can be reinvested in lots of different projects. I think we have to fundamentally rethink the energy future. And my fear is that, following COP28 and following Davos and following the whole kind of obsession now with going back to burning fossil fuels, obviously we've had the bill going through the House of Commons just the other week, which gives hundreds of new licenses in the North Sea. My fear is that instead of prioritizing these decentralized community solutions and really putting lots of investment into renewables, we're talking about these tired, old, inefficient solutions like nuclear, and worse still, like fossil fuels. It's just not good enough.
Thank you. And I suppose that naturally leads us on to the Scottish offshore wind projects, worth around £500 million, moving closer to completion. First Minister Hamza Yousaf has announced today that strategic investment to help unlock Scotland's green energy revolution has moved a step closer. In a significant milestone for Scotland's offshore wind sector, 3 projects have been invited to move to stage 2 of the Strategic Investment Model (SIM) process. Collectively, the projects, which represent a mix of local and inward investment into ports, port infrastructure and manufacturing, have a capital expenditure of around £500 million. The SIM will help to deliver transformational offshore wind supply chain growth in Scotland through innovative collaboration between offshore wind developers, the Scottish Government, enterprise agencies and the Crown Estate of Scotland. Making the announcement of a Scottish Renewable and Offshore Wind Conference in Glasgow, First Minister Hamza Yousaf said, "There are moments when certain industries can stand confident that when they look ahead and they will see the future in which they play a pivotal role in securing the wealth and well-being of a nation. Scotland's offshore industry is at that moment. Together, we can create the right conditions to attract investment, build the supply chain, recruit and deliver the infrastructure needs to ensure that these projects will thrive." A select group of 3 initial projects have been invited to move to stage 2 of the SIM process in a significant milestone in our offshore program. They represent a mix of local and inward investment opportunities into ports, port infrastructure, and manufacturing collectively. They have a capital expenditure of just under £500 million. Olaf, it's okay. I'm going to ask a pretty technical question first, and we can skip over it if you don't have the answer for it. How significant is reaching stage 2 of an SIM process? What does that mean? How many stages are there? Do you know anything about this?
I have to say I'm not an expert on the offshore wind industry, but certainly when it comes to the big investment in offshore wind, obviously we've had the ScotWind auction, which was one of the biggest in history, and there is clearly an industrial strategy that the Scottish Government is committed to executing. Look, I live in Burntisland in Fife, which is part of the Firth of Forth Green Freeport, and there are some really ambitious plans actually to manufacture a lot of the wind turbines in Leith and to assemble a lot of them just off the coast of Burntisland, That will obviously bring a lot of industry to the entire Firth of Forth area. And in particular, when we're talking about these supply chains, it's so important that it's the people in the local areas that benefit from long-term sustainable jobs. What we don't want is for Scotland to be a playground for big corporate investors to siphon money from our renewable bounty and to not bring back any jobs or any benefit to the Scottish economy. What we need is this integrated industrial strategy, and I think the Scottish government is actually showing that they have that long-term thinking required to actually attract investment in the long term. So, look, the supply chain is absolutely pivotal, and yeah, it's really good to hear. It's great news.
Thank you. Shifting our sights over to the wider Europe, anti-European populists on track to make big gains in EU elections. Polling is suggesting that populist anti-European parties are heading for big gains in June's European elections that could shift the Parliament's balance sharply to the right and jeopardize key pillars of the EU's agenda, including climate action. Polling in all 27 EU member states, combined with modelling of how national parties performed in past European Parliament elections, shows radical right parties are on course to finish first in 9 countries, including Austria, France, and Poland. The report for the European Council on Foreign Relations, ECFR, says the analysis should serve as a wake-up call for European policymakers about what is at stake in this coming election. Researchers said the implications of the vote were far-reaching, arguing the next European Parliament could block laws on Europe's Green Deal and take a harder line on other areas of EU sovereignty, including migration, enlargement, and support for Ukraine. Domestic debates could also be affected, they said, bolstering the growing axes of government trying to limit the EU's influence from within. Hungary, Italy, Slovakia, Sweden, and, if Geert Wilder's PVV heads its new government, the Netherlands. The possible return of Donald Trump in the US and a right-leaning, inward-focused coalition in the European Parliament could result in a rejection of strategic interdependence and international partnerships in the defense of European interests and values, they warned. But projections showed the mainstream political groups in the Parliament, the centre-right European People's Party, EPP, centre-left Socialist and Democrats, S&D, the centrist Renew Europe, RE, and the Greens, GEFA, all losing MEPs. Although the EPP looks likely to remain the largest group, retain its agenda-setting power, and determine the choice of the next Commission President, the report argues that populist voices will carry most weight in several founding member states, with Giorgia Meloni's Brothers of Italy forecast to boost its MEP tally to 27, and Marine Le Pen's National Rally on track to win a record 25 seats. In Austria, the radical right freedom group, FPO, is projected to double its total of MEPs to 6, while in Germany, the far-right alternative for Deutschland, AfD, looks likely to nearly double its representation in the 705-seat parliament to 19. Populist Eurosceptic parties are likely to come first in Austria, Belgium, and the Czech Republic, France, Hungary, Italy, the Netherlands, Poland, and Slovakia. As a result, the far-right ID group is projected to gain up to 40 more seats for a total of 98, potentially making it the third political force and opening up the possibility of a populist right coalition with the EPP, ECR, and the ID, with 49% of MEPs in the new parliament. The report says, the polling and modelling suggested the current centre-left coalition, SND, EFA, and left, will see its MEP tally fall to 33% from 36% of the total, with the main centre-right coalition, EPP, RE, and ECR, slipping to 48% from 49%. The report calls on policymakers to examine the trends that are driving current voting patterns in Europe and to develop clear narratives and address the necessity of global Europe in an increasingly fraught and dangerous geopolitical climate. Olaf, are there strengths of the European Union that the EU is failing to portray to its member states?
I think there's been a long-standing problem of progressives and people on the left to speak about successes of the EU in a way that's relatable to people. We see, look, a huge wave of dissatisfaction with the broken economic system that we've got. Since 2008 and the economic crash, most people are feeling worse off. There is an increasing feeling that the main parties of the centre left and centre right are just not speaking the voters' language. And I think in the absence of a credible, radical, but electable alternative on the left, there is a big surge towards the far right. And, this is extremely worrying stuff because already in 2014, we've had the biggest far right surge in the European Parliament. In 2019, that was slightly stymied after the European countries realized the bad impacts of Brexit. But now this is looking pretty seismic, right? I mean, in 2014, 10 years ago, we wouldn't have thought about the possibility of Scandinavian countries, for example, being dominated by the far right. Right now, we've got Sweden and Finland, where the far right are among the strongest parties. We've got a situation where in Germany, again, 10 years ago, the AfD was not in parliament. In 2014, the AfD was very much in the fringes of politics. And right now, they're the second biggest party, and actually not just the second biggest party, influencing the politics of the centre-right party, the CDU, right? Now, it's heartening to see that there's big protests in Germany against the AfD. I think that the AfD story, by the way, requires a whole separate story in itself, because obviously this is the party that published a plan to deport millions of people from Germany with a migration background to a model state in North Africa, which is kind of reminiscent of the Nazi 1940 plan to deport 4 million Jews to Madagascar. But aside from that, there is a strong tendency where the progressive forces in Europe just are not able to challenge the ideas of the far right. And my fear is that the more we talk about banning the far right, or the more we talk up the kind of panic that's settling in Europe, rightly so, the less we talk about the ideas that we need to defeat the far right in the battle of ideas. And look, the European elections are very soon. They're in June. I just do not see the moral leadership from any major European leader who's ready to confront the far right head on and say, look, this politics of division is not going to make you richer. It's not going to bring back dignity that you want. This is not the way forward. Instead, we're just kind of running and scrambling for solutions, how to stop them. But the left desperately needs to have a coherent plan to tackle this.
Thank you for that. Scottish Government proposes continuing rent protection measures for private tenants. Regulations to protect tenants concerned about rent increases following the end of the emergency rent cap have been laid in the Scottish Parliament. From 1st of April onwards, subject of parliamentary approval, the process for rent adjudication will temporarily be modified for 1 year. Any tenant who wishes to dispute a rent increase notice can apply for rent adjudication. In such cases, Rent Service Scotland or the first-tier tribunal will set rent based on the lowest of the following figures: either the open market rate, the rent requested by the landlord, or a comparator based on the difference between the market rate and the current rate. The SNP has welcomed the new protections for tenants against rent increases, saying it will make Scotland a fairer, more affordable place to live by empowering those living in private tenancies. SNP MSP for Glasgow Kelvin Cowcab Stewart said, "The Scottish Government is putting power into the hands of tenants, reducing rent increases and giving more certainty to those who are struggling. As we progress towards longer-term rent controls, it is vital that we empower those in privately rented accommodation and do everything we can to make housing affordable." This follows the significant progress made by the SNP and government, which has delivered 126,396 affordable homes since 2007, over 40% more per head of population than in England, while making Scotland the fairest place to rent in the UK after the introduction of private residential tenancies in 2017 with the very limited powers it has. Olaf, as somebody that works with students and presumably lots of new or first-time buyers, has rent protection been effective at making accommodation affordable, or perhaps has it even had unforeseen negative consequences?
So there's a couple of caveats to this. Obviously, the rent cap that was introduced in the cost of living crisis, that was emergency legislation that's expiring on the 31st of March. And it's great to see the announcement that the rent adjudication system is coming on the 1st of April. So hopefully we're going to avoid that cliff edge that a lot of people are fearing, that landlords would just increase prices drastically to make up for the losses that they made relatively during the rent cap period. But look, the student housing crisis is really acute. And I think there's no running away from this. You have a situation where at the moment most students are actually excluded from the rent cap because students who live in PBSA, it's a private purpose-built student accommodation, they are not part of the rent cap. So the contracts for PBSA are completely separate. PBSA providers can charge whatever they want. And actually, in the past 3 years, there's been a 34% increase in the rents, right? That's a lot higher than the level of inflation. These are mostly profiteering corporations, 82 of them, by the way, based offshore. So these are huge companies that are really profiting off students and exacerbating this crisis. In terms of private tenancies, again, students have benefited from this, no doubt. The rent cap of 3% has helped to alleviate, some of the cost pressures. But we can't forget that there's a loophole, which means that when there's a change in tenancy, for example, one student in HMO moves out, or somebody has to temporarily leave and the tenancy changes, the landlord has the power to increase the rent above the 3% cap. Essentially, the cap is only applicable to the person and not to the tenancy. So there's a couple of loopholes that have to be fixed in there. And I think ultimately Scotland is way ahead of the UK when it comes to rent protections, when it comes to tenants' rights, when it comes to affordable homes. That's great. But I think it's really important for the Scottish Government not to rest on its laurels. Rents are way too high in this country. I think the average rent for a two-bedroom property in the last year, between 22-23 and 23-24, I think it's risen by 14%. Now, inflation has been 9%. So I think there is a housing crisis that needs to be addressed. It's no coincidence that Glasgow, Edinburgh, and Argyll and Bute have declared housing emergencies. And what we need from the government is actually a bit more ambition. You have all the right intentions, but I think sometimes the government is being a bit timid in going all the way. And the solution to this ideally would be a system of rent controls that actually bring prices down in the long term, because it's not good enough to be simply limiting future increases. I think it's better than nothing. I think it's an important step towards more fairness. But if we genuinely want to tackle the housing crisis that we've got, you'd need to find a mechanism where prices can actually be limited and brought down in the long term.
Thank you. Scottish Government has also published Good Food Nation plans. Ensuring everyone in Scotland can access nutritious, sustainable food is at the heart of new plans to transform the country's food system. The Good Food Nation plan sets out ways in which the Scottish Government will work with businesses and organisations across society to help people connect to locally produced high-quality food. The plan will cover everything from farm to fork and beyond, and to draw together a range of different policies. It will also require key public bodies, particularly local authorities and health boards, to set out their plans. Small business, innovation, tourism, and Trade Minister Richard Lochhead launched the consultation during a visit to City of Glasgow College, where he helped national chef Gary McLean and catering students prepare a Burns supper. The food and drink industry is a major contributor to Scotland's economy. Over 17,000 businesses employ 129,000 people, many in economically fragile rural and island communities. The sector generates turnover of around £15 billion per annum, and exports of Scottish food and drink were valued at £8.1 billion in 2022. Mr. Lochhead had said the following: "This week, the world will celebrate Burns Night, which contributes to a thriving food culture and interest in Scottish cuisine. Supermarkets will offer Scottish dishes to shoppers, and many will use Scottish ingredients to prepare their traditional Burns suppers." In Good Food Nation, this celebration of good quality and sustainable Scottish produce will be the norm. People across the nation will be able to easily access high-quality food and drink, and will benefit from the food they produce. Buy, cook, and eat each day. We have come far in this journey, but we recognize that more needs to be done. That's why we are seeking views on our fresh approach to food policy to make the vision for our food system a reality. End quote. The consultation of a national Good Food Nation plan has been published on the Scottish Government website today. The consultation will be open for responses until Monday, 22nd April 2024. Olaf, where is access to good food lacking most? Are workplace meals perhaps due for a makeover?
I think it's lacking in places with the highest levels of deprivation, right? I mean, Scotland has a lot of poverty deserts and places where people without access to public transport, for example, cannot access places where you can get groceries. Like I live in an area of multiple deprivation in Fife, and the nearest supermarket from my house is 20 minutes away now. Now, a lot of people that maybe have reduced mobility or don't have cars can't immediately go to that supermarket, and there isn't a shop nearby where you can get fresh food or a community garden where you can get it. Of course, in smaller towns and more deprived areas, food tends to be more expensive because we don't have as many supermarkets. And there is still a lack of this integrated approach in what kind of food do we give to people in schools and the workplace. As you say, there's a big reliance on meal deals, of course, and I mean, I'm guilty of that myself. When I'm in the office, I often just pick up a meal deal without much regard of the environmental impact or how good it actually is. So I think this is really, really ambitious and really promising because, firstly, when this comes to pass, and it's been a long time coming, Scotland's going to be the first, I think, UK nation to have a national food plan. And I think food and drink is Scotland's national pride. We export a lot of it. We export, obviously, the finest Scottish salmon and whiskey and seed potatoes and whatnot. So it's really important that the kind of excellence in the food and drink industry in Scotland is actually passed down to the people that need it most. And if this bill doesn't consider those in the most deprived communities, it will be a failure. So I think it's really, really important that that poverty aspect is being taken into account. And that includes, firstly, making food more accessible. Secondly, making it cheaper. And thirdly, rebalancing the supply chain so that food can be bought as locally as possible. Look, I would love to see more community gardens, for example, right? Places where people can just come together with a community, learn how to plant, learn how to cultivate gardens. It's also part of reskilling and creating that community awareness. But it's difficult, right? There's a lot of challenges. I mean, I would love to see a community garden in my area, but I know that people in my area are working several jobs and struggling as it is, and it's quite difficult to maybe get into that space where you have the time and the energy to have a community garden. So look, this is really exciting. We'll see how the consultation goes, but it's a really promising piece of legislation, and hopefully we're going to get to a stage where every single person can live a healthier life, and that's obviously a benefit to the economy and to the health system and to society overall. So great.
Thanks. Another plan that the Scottish Government is looking up is the Electoral Reform Bill, legislation which aims to enhance Scotland's democratic processes, has been published on the Scottish Parliament website. The Scottish Elections Representation and Reform Bill includes provisions to encourage the piloting of electoral innovations such as digital polling cards, and provides powers for elections to be rescheduled in emergencies, for example, a COVID-style health emergency. Under the bill, foreign nationals living and working in Scotland on a time-limited visa would become eligible to stand as candidates in Scottish Parliament and local government elections, in addition to their existing voting rights. If passed by the Scottish Parliament, the legislation would ban people from being MSPs if they are found guilty of intimidating campaigners and electoral workers. The bill, introduced to the Parliament by the Scottish Government, also proposes changes to campaign rules for elections to improve fairness, transparency, and controls against foreign spending. It will allow ministers to provide funding to drive up democratic engagement. Following the responses to the extensive public consultation, the bill does not propose extending candidacy rights to 16 and 17-year-olds. Minister for Parliamentary Business George Adams said, A robust electoral system is fundamental to the success of Scotland, being an inclusive and vibrant democracy that makes everyone feel included and empowered. It is important that as many people in our society as possible feel they have an effective and independent means to hold governments to account, and feel encouraged to take an active interest in politics and civic life, including voting and standing for election. Everyone living in Scotland should have a say on how Scotland is run, and the wide-ranging measures in this bill share the common thread of empowering everyone with an interest in improving democracy. Olaf, does digital polling have the power to fundamentally change how different demographics are represented in votes?
Look, I think so. I think the point of this bill is quite wide ranging, right? So the digital part is one element of it, and I'm not entirely convinced if people are ready for digital voting yet. But I think certainly having digital polling cards reduces the need to have physical stuff, and obviously we've got voter ID. So if you can just have a digital polling card on your phone, that makes it a lot easier. But I think the most exciting part of this bill is actually enshrining that right for foreign nationals to not just vote but to stand for election as well. Look, I was born in Poland. I'm an EU citizen as well, and it was an incredible moment of pride actually in 2014 when I lived in Scotland for many years at that point, but EU citizens could vote in the biggest referendum in Scotland's history, in the biggest democratic exercise in hundreds of years. And that was really a sign, that was really a symbol of the sort of society that we're seeking to build. And in 2021, for example, the Scottish Parliament election was the first where refugees could vote. Now, again, that's hugely emblematic of the Scottish Government's approach towards New Scots and towards inclusion. For some New Scots that have fled places like Syria or Afghanistan, oppressive governments and terror, that election in 2021 was the first time they could participate in a free and fair election. We had, in 2022, in the council elections 2 years ago, Rosa Sally, the refugee who came to Scotland as a child from Kurdistan, becoming a councillor. We've had before in previous parliaments, citizens of France, for example, like Christian Allard, MSP. He wasn't a UK citizen, but he became an MSP. So I think this is incredibly exciting, and it really speaks to the sort of country that Scotland is trying to become. And just look at the contrast with Westminster, right? Just look at the contrast where the Westminster government is disenfranchising people by introducing voter ID. And that's had an impact already, because if you look at the council elections or the by-elections, there's been a slight drop in votes from the most disadvantaged communities. The shameful and hateful rhetoric about the Rwanda bill and about deportations, and Rishi Sunak just today saying that if you have audacity to take the knee against racism, it's un-British. It is just a complete black hole of contrast between the Westminster and the Scottish government. And for all the faults that the Scottish government undoubtedly often has, this is by far one of the proudest moments, actually. This bill, this approach to democracy, modernising our society, this is really the best of Scotland, and it's great to see.
Well, thank you so much. That brings us to a close for today. Thank you so much for joining me, Olaf Stando, from the National Union of Students in Scotland. And what was the other organisation you wanted me to mention?
So it's the YSI. I'm also the SNP convener here in Fife, and I've got quite a few hats on. But yeah, it's the Scotland.
I didn't feel confident listing everything. The resume was too long for me. I'm so sorry. Okay. But yeah, thank you so much for joining me. I hope our viewers enjoyed the show, and I'll be wrapping up. That is it for this evening. Before I go, I just wanted to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Thank you to everyone who has donated to our emergency crowdfunder over the past 2 weeks. We are now only £2,000 short of our target and very hopeful that we will reach £10,000 by the end of a week. Although the immediate pressure has been eased, and we can now focus on securing the future of independent broadcasting for Scotland, our need to grow our subscriber base and increase our funding is still urgent. But setting that aside, good night, and thank you for watching.